was 10 years old, growing up in County Limerick, I lived near an older lady, Mrs. Regan, and she and I were great friends. I visited her every day, several times a day. One time, she left me and went away for a week, and when she came back, she brought me a little gift, and it was a gift of a ruler with a strip of images across the front, like a reel of photo negatives. And on it, there were pictures of the cliffs of Moher and the Burren, and places that she had visited on her holidays in County Clare. And that's my very first introduction to tourism. It was the first time that I remember wanting to go somewhere else because it seemed so wonderful and so different and even a bit exotic. And I absolutely pestered her. If she ever were to go there again, she had to bring me with her. And sure enough, about a year later, I found myself sitting beside her on a bus on our way to the cliffs of Moher in County Clare. And on that day, the cliffs of Moher absolutely took my breath away. And that day was one of the most memorable and the brightest memories of my childhood. Of course, I didn't know at that time that there was such a thing as the tourism industry, that there was a huge big machine all around the world working hard to get us all to travel more, to visit more, and to spend a bit more as well. I didn't know that the ruler was a clever little marketing tool that eventually got Mrs. Regan to go back and to bring somebody else with her as well. I was 9 when I got the ruler, and at that time there were about 280 million international visitors. I was 39 when I got my first role in tourism, and by then that number had risen to nearly 1 billion. Tourism had literally exploded. Regions and countries all around the world had identified tourism as a driver of employment and of economic growth. And I suppose the equation was simple enough, that the more visitors that would come, the more money would flow into the destination, and the better off the citizens would be. And by that logic, the destinations that attracted the most visitors were the most successful destinations. And we started to see some real winners emerge with that. We started to even call them the bucket list destinations, the ones you just couldn't miss on your round-the-world ticket. Places like Venice, or Machu Picchu, Amsterdam, the Great Wall of China, Everest if you were up for it, and even the cliffs of Moher. And for a while, these were really considered the winners in the tourism game, in the numbers game. But then things started to change a little bit, and we heard of this new term called over-tourism. And some of those bucket list winners started to look a little less like winners. And host communities started to find their voice, and it wasn't always a welcoming one. Flight shame became a new term. People started to question the impact of all this discretionary travel on the environment. And some people even labelled the industry as extractive. There was a growing feeling that the industry was mining places and heritage and culture for profit, without due consideration for how that profit was distributed and what the impact of all the mining was on the place itself. There was growing evidence that there was a problem at the very heart of the numbers model. And that was that there had to come a tipping point where the growth in visitor numbers would actually lead to less benefit for host communities and for the world overall. And all the while, the numbers kept growing, up to 1.4 billion by 2019, and predicted to double to nearly 3 billion by 2030. In fact, many people proclaimed in the industry that the growth in tourism was actually unstoppable. Until, of course, it did stop completely. COVID-19 has drawn a line in the sand for the tourism industry. Before that line is that growth journey up to 2019 levels. And after that line is what is yet to emerge. We've been lingering on this line for quite a while now, as the industry has teetered between complete shutdown and tentative openings and reopenings. And while we've stood here, some interesting questions have started to be asked, questions that seem to signal a real desire for change. Things like, how can we reimagine tourism? How can tourism build back better? How can we create a model of tourism that gives back more than it takes? However, when the rubber started to hit the runway again, familiar goals bounced back. And the main question now seems to be, how long will it take us to get back to 2019 levels? Even though 2019 levels had already exposed the limits of the numbers-driven model. The line in the sand hasn't washed away yet, and even when it does, we will never forget that it was there in the first place. We can never again say that the thing was so big that we couldn't change it, or that it was moving so fast that we couldn't turn it around. We own this moment right now. And the big question is, are we brave enough to leave behind a paradigm that served us well in the past, but which will not serve us so well in the future? The question is, can we leave that behind us as we stand and think? Interestingly, there have been places around the world that have thought about this before, that did stop and think and ponder the purpose of tourism and had the courage to at least imagine a different future. One of those areas was the Burren Cliffs of Moher Geopark, here in the west of Ireland, not far from where we are right now. And that's where I got my very first job in tourism, in exactly the same places that the pictures were from on the ruler that Mrs. Regan had given me 30 years before that. And that's just a coincidence. So, to tell you a little bit about the Burren. The Burren is an area of karst limestone landscape here in the west of Ireland. It is unique in the world in terms of geology, botany, archaeology, and agriculture. It has a spiritual value, it has an austere beauty, and it is definitely a place apart. Tourism in a place like this would always be a sensitive question. To be really, really simplistic about it, there were two ends to the argument. On the one end, there were those who believed that a growth in tourism would lead to a growth in local jobs and more opportunities for local people. On the other end were those who believed that a growth in visitor numbers would actually damage the fragile landscape, would dilute the culture, and would impinge on the way of life of local people. And most people were somewhere along the spectrum between those 2 points. My first job was to be animator of the Burren Ecotourism Network. And what that meant was that it was my job to grow and strengthen a network of tourism businesses and to get their commitment to embedding sustainable practices in the region. And that led to a lot of conversations, not about whether to grow tourism, not about if to grow tourism, but really whether to grow tourism and what the purpose of tourism would be in the place. And I got to listen and observe and analyze many of those conversations. And I came to realize over that time that the two ends of the argument were embedded in exactly the same thing. They had the same root. Those who wanted tourism wanted it because they loved the place and they wanted to see it thrive. Those who didn't want tourism didn't want it because they loved the place and they wanted it to thrive. A deep love of place was the one thing that united everybody, whether they were for tourism, against tourism, or somewhere in between. We came to realize amongst us that the purpose of tourism in the Burren Cliffs of Moher Geopark had to be to protect and flourish the place. And if tourism could help to do that, then it was to be welcomed. And if it couldn't, why would it even be tolerated? And that realization led us to shift the focus from growing visitor numbers to growing visitor value, and not just economic value. It moved us from a numbers paradigm to a place paradigm. And that allowed us to believe that if we looked after the place, the number would look after itself. So in the last 18 months, I've invited many speakers from around Ireland and around the world to come and share their wisdom and insight with groups that we work with here in Ireland. And I've come through that to realize that many places are having a similar shift in mindset. There's a place in New Zealand called the Tourism Bay of Plenty. And Kristen Dunn was the CEO of the organisation Tourism Bay of Plenty. And she told our group how they had come to a collective shift in consciousness that made them realize that the purpose of tourism in the Bay of Plenty was to grow the love of the place and to grow legacy for future generations. In Flanders in Belgium, Elke Dens was the marketing director of Visit Flanders. And she told how they reset the purpose of their tourism strategy, their marketing strategy, from growing more to flourishing better. And in neither of those places was it about less visitors. They both experienced double-digit and above-average growth, and that was the experience in the Burren and Cliffs of Moher Geopark as well. So it was not about less. It was about a different kind of more. It was about more value for the local residents, more value for the place, more value for the visitor, and more value for the host. What I realized from that as well, from other destinations that I had worked in after working with the Burren groups, is that whenever people are given a chance to really think about the purpose of tourism in their region, a similar pattern of thought emerges. And that has come to make me believe that there is a universal truth, and that is that the true connector in tourism is love of place, and the true purpose of tourism is to create the conditions for the place to flourish. Now, I know what you might be thinking, that all sounds very nice and very lovely and very interesting, but maybe also a little bit fluffy. You can feel it here in your gut, you can feel it in your heart, but what do you do with it? What does your head do with that in the real world? And we get that because we came to that exact question in the Burren as well. As I said, my job was to grow a network of businesses around the principle of ecotourism. And we were always going to need more than sentiment for that to happen. The task was to make this paradigm of place tangible and palatable and, above all, actionable. So what did we do? Well, we certainly had to deploy our heads at that stage. And what we did, when the region was in the process of being designated as a geopark, the managers of the geopark asked people in communities and in businesses and agencies what they wanted for this special place. And they distilled all that information into the mission statement of the geopark. And we started there and we looked at that and we discovered that people had been very clear about what they wanted for their place. And there were 6 things. They wanted people working together. They wanted a cared-for landscape. They wanted a well-understood heritage, strengthened livelihoods, vibrant communities, and sustainable use of resources. And when we stopped to look, we realized that if that's what people had said they wanted, then that should be the very framework of tourism development strategy for the region. And out of that grew the Geopark Code of Practice for Sustainable Tourism. Those 6 outcomes that people had said they wanted became the 6 principles of a code of practice that all businesses could subscribe to. But we were careful that it would be a code of practice and not a code of principle. So each of those principles was taken and reframed as a commitment to action. So for example, a cared-for landscape became the action statement commitment. We actively participate in conserving our cultural and natural heritage. And with that commitment in mind, we then sat down and defined the specific actions that businesses in the geopark could take to fulfill that commitment. So for example, for a cared-for landscape, one action they could take was do Leave No Trace training and embed the principles of Leave No Trace in the visitor experience. There were 60 actions in total, or about 60 in total. And the value of defining and very clearly describing the commitments and the actions was that every business came to the same understanding of what was required and why, and they were able to take collective action. So here's how it worked. If a business wanted to join the Burren Ecotourism Network, it first had to subscribe to the Code of Practice. Once it joined, the business would get access to training and supports to help them work through the actions of the code. Once they showed they had implemented the actions, it was possible to include them in the marketing strategy for the destination. And the marketing strategy itself used the Code of Practice as the unique selling point for the destination. So it was like a virtuous circle. You had to implement the Code of Practice to get involved in the marketing strategy, but the marketing strategy would only work if the Code of Practice was implemented. So the commercial return was built in, but only after the place had been looked after. At the time that the Burren Ecotourism Network was launched in 2011, there were 18 businesses involved. Today, there are more than 70. And the businesses and the network and the geopark itself have been recognized many times for leadership and innovation in sustainable tourism. They have been recognized nationally, they have been recognized at a European level, and also even at a global level. And that's the magic of the Geopark Code of Practice for sustainable tourism. The principles are universal, they are global, they can apply to any destination. But the actions that define them are local. By defining, each place can define the actions that best bring those principles to life in their particular place. Now, listening to me, you could be forgiven for thinking that all of this was a new discovery, that we had discovered actually something new. And of course we didn't, because the paradigm of place is as old as places themselves. Those principles have been encoded in natural law and in indigenous wisdom for millennia. So we had a code of practice, but the codes were already there. They're the kind of things that we know instinctively and intuitively. So take our Celtic wisdom, for example. The Celts saw the oak tree as the tree of life. Oak trees grow tall and mighty, but after a while they stop growing upwards and they grow wide and rich and deep. And encoded in that symbol is the natural law that nothing grows forever and that not all growth is upwards. From the Maori culture, on the other side of the world, we have a concept called kaitiakitanga. And it doesn't have a direct translation in English. It's more of a worldview captured in a single word. And according to this, the worldview is that it is our role and it's our responsibility to protect and guard the richness of the world that has been passed on to us so that we can pass that to future generations. Encoded in that word is the leadership of place. And interestingly, this is one of the principles that underpins the New Zealand Sustainable Tourism Strategy. And it's not unusual for people in New Zealand in the industry to refer to themselves as kaitiaki, or guardians and stewards of their place. My favorite word in our own native language is mishnach. And again, it doesn't have a particular direct translation into English. We loosely translate it as bravery. But encoded in mishnach is thousands of years of wisdom that tells us that it's a bravery that comes from the heart, from the spirit, from inner strength. It's a bravery that takes courageous decisions from a position of conviction and resilience and fortitude. At the moment, the line is still visible in the stand. We're still standing here somewhere between what has gone before and what is yet to come. As tourism re-emerges into the world, it's possible that kaitiaki and mishnach provide us with the type of wisdom and the basis for a leadership that can emerge along with tourism again. They can inspire us to become stewards and guardians of our place and to lead courageously from the heart. And maybe it's not such a mad thing to listen first to the wisdom of our heart and our gut, and to let our brains take its lead from there. Such a shift in mindset would allow us to leave the numbers paradigm fade and go in order to let the place paradigm take root and flourish. Thank you.